But to go back to Susan's question, you're not saying that prosecutors shouldn't have the right to strike plea deals with offenders.
They should not have, they should have the right, but I also think that we need to look at what they're doing when they do a plea bargain. Do you, in fact, when you've had 2 incidences of burglary 1, do you then plea bargain both of those down to a lesser offense? If you did it the first time, would you do it the second time? Allow for a plea bargain for a second time on something that was just as bad as the first time but was plea bargained down?
I think there was a proposal before the Judiciary Committee this time to require the prosecutors to say in open court on the record why. But I just spoke to John Conway, and he said that's routinely done anyway. When they, for example, on this sexual assault 1 down to 2, I haven't seen the transcript yet, but the presumption from him was that, yeah, that was said in open court. They didn't want to put the 5-year-old on the stand.
Okay.
What about when prisoners are released on probation? It's not a question for the commissioner, but this particular suspect didn't have a place to live. He was released to a shelter. Does that require additional monitoring if someone's not going into a structured environment, say a halfway house or their family?
It's an excellent point, and part of the legislation that we passed back in January requires us, we have a committee formed to seek out places, for example, within the state that would take a shelter or a place for sex offenders. We sent out through the department a RFP several weeks ago, and not one person or one organization responded.
Can we ask Arthur a question since he's here and is the ranking member of Judiciary? Would you mind, Arthur, stepping to the podium? Am I stating that wrong? I mean, wasn't that one of the proposals that was voted down in Judish last week that would require the prosecutor to say on the record in open court?
That was part of the 3 strikes proposal that the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee put forward, and it would have required that if the prosecutor did not use the 3 strikes law or the persistent felony offender law, that he had to explain why, even though the defendant was eligible for use of that law, why he was choosing not to go forward with that kind of a proposal, with that kind of a charge. And there was other legislation that would have required it on a broader scale. Would not have done anything about a 3 strikes, but would simply have required the prosecutor to explain in open court. And while it may be done by John Connolly and in Waterbury's judicial district, I'm not sure that it's done everywhere, because the chief state's attorney did go through a fairly elaborate sort of thought experiment to try to figure out what effect it would have on him and his prosecutors if they were required to routinely explain on the record why they were choosing not to use the persistent felony offender law. So maybe John Connolly explains in detail why he's choosing not to use that law, but I don't think anybody else is.
Do you think it would have made the 3 strikes law would have made any difference in this guy's case?
Well, I think
because of the 2.
A second striker is eligible for enhanced penalties. And so the law that's on the books now could have been used. Now, there are lots of factors that go into a decision about how to plea bargain a case, and there may have been lots of reasons to make the decision that John Connolly and his people made in this particular case. But the fact that you would require an explanation would at least make the prosecutors in all the jurisdictions explain what they're doing. And we believe that if the prosecutors had a certainty that a 3rd strike would get a life sentence, that would make it easier for them to plea bargain. And so it does 2 things. It makes the prosecutors more accountable. The proposal we had in the Judiciary Committee would begin making the prosecutors more accountable for the decisions they make, and would have taken away a little bit of discretion away from a judge.
Governor, do you think this case maybe points more to the need to do something with sex offenders when they are released? I mean, you say you can't get anything cited. How come there's never any talk of maybe citing some sort of a facility or transitional housing on state property? We have acres and acres of land where something like that could be built. Maybe the state should be the ones that handle that.
And actually, it's one of the things we've looked at. It's like state facilities. It's also like prisons. Rather than citing it in a different place, we do have state-owned property. It still is in a municipality, no matter whether it's state-owned or not. And you need to have at least the discussions with the municipal leaders before you proceed in that direction. And I would want to do the same thing. I also talked to the commissioner not today on this subject. We were talking about this particular case, but before, Commissioner of Corrections, talking about places for sexual offenders. And one of the problems that comes in is that in prison we also have programs for sexual offenders, but they can opt out of it. If they do not wish to participate, we cannot require them to do so. That's something I'd like to look at as well. I mean, you can't make a person sit there through a class. It's the same as taking a, not the same obviously, but you know, requiring someone to take a GED. If they want to take it, fine. If they don't, they're not forced to do so. Is it time that we change that as well? So there are some things I think we've learned over the last 6 months or more as we look into this, but today I just have to tell you that my heart goes out to these people, to these families. And when you think in terms of what has happened just out of nowhere, just as the case in Cheshire, I mean, it's just a random, heinous act that has absolutely no rational reason behind it.
Aren't you, getting back to the sex offender question, you talked about meeting with municipalities. Didn't we run into this problem a few years back in the prior administration? Hey, who wants to host a new prison?
Right.
You know, people weren't running for that. Can you imagine being a first selectman or a mayor or the chairman of a town council and going to your voters and saying, yeah, you know, we're going to have a sexual offender treatment center? I just don't see how you're going to overcome that. No, I think what Sue was getting at.
Right.
Isn't it?
It's the
Doesn't
same
it point to the need
Well,
for
I
the
think
state to step in and say, okay, we're going to cite it here on our property?
Right, but I'm saying that, and I thought I answered that. I was probably trying delicately to say what you were saying, but for a state, if you own state property, that state property might be, you know, in Voluntown. A lot of it is all forest out there. I mean, would you want to take a piece of that property and say you're going to have it here? Not unless you work with and meet with the people who live in Voluntown. I mean, you know, you simply can't do that to a municipality. So that's why we've put this committee together. And Brian Austin will be chairing that committee. That's part of the legislation that passed back in January. And they will be looking at ways that we can enhance, as we did with prisons, I might add, that we said if you cite a prison in your town, you will get 100% pilot. It was an incentive. So they will be looking to see if there are things that they can do to either provide incentives or some other measure to cite a facility in this state.
Did your office here?
What do we do in the meantime? I mean, I know in homeless shelters, these guys can't stay there all day. We ran into this problem with the polyps. There's a huge problem
Right.
where there's no place for sex offenders to go when they get out of prison.
There
They
is-
don't want them at many homeless shelters because there are families there.
Exactly. One of the things that obviously we had looked at before in the Pollock case was that there was a facility across the border. They were more than willing at the time, but the person didn't want to go, doesn't have to go into that place. But for those who list the shelters as their home address, I mean, that's what we are using now if they go into shelters. Do we build another place? I don't know. You know, Sue, I'm sort of thinking out loud, do you build another place within a prison that says this is a, you know, a place for these individuals to live? This is what the committee will be looking at. If we can't cite a place, can we build a place that's within our own facilities now?
Have you mentioned that you've gotten emails and calls. Have you heard from any members of the Hawk or Pettit family?
I don't know. In fact, we stopped. I had not as of like an hour ago, unless someone in here knows differently. But I will tell you, I've heard from a lot of senior citizens, and a lot of people are just saying, you know, this is just outrageous, and they are afraid. All right, everyone. Thank you. I appreciate it.